Eddie Johnson had a pure jump shot that always felt like it was going to fall, helping him become a 20-point per game scorer before becoming the ideal sixth man, with him winning the award one time. All the while playing for numerous playoffs teams that always seemed to fall just short of making the NBA Finals. Eddie Johnson was also a clutch shooter who could get you a basket when you needed it with his ability from his jumper, while always seeming to run off screens at the perfect time. This is a look back on Eddie Johnson's career. Eddie Johnson was born and raised in Chicago, growing up in a rough neighborhood, where he would go on to play basketball at Westinghouse High School to stay out of trouble. While there, he would develop into one of the top recruits in the country, becoming a parade All-American. And when it came time to decide where to go to school, Johnson would stay close to home and attend Illinois, who were in desperate need of him. While at Illinois, Eddie Johnson would help turn the program around, guiding them back to the NCAA tournament his senior year. But he is most known for his game winner against number 1 ranked Michigan State, led by Magic Johnson. Eddie Johnson, his senior year, averaged 17.2 points, 9.2 rebounds, and 2.4 assists, where he would earn all Big Ten honors and start to catch the eyes of NBA scouts. However, he was still not as highly anticipated as a prospect entering the NBA draft. Eddie Johnson would slide into the second round of the 1981 NBA draft, where he'd be selected by the Kansas City Kings with the 29th overall pick. Johnson would enter training camp with no guarantee of making the team as a result, but he would earn a spot through his play making the team. Now, Eddie Johnson was joining a Kings team led by Mike Woodson, Cliff Robinson, before he would be traded mid-year. Eddie Johnson, his rookie year, would find himself grinding to carve out a role into the team, seeing his usage increase as the year went along. Eddie Johnson, year 1, averaged 9.3 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 1.5 assists. All the while, the Kings were struggling without Cliff Robinson, going 30-52, missing the playoffs. Eddie Johnson in the offseason would continue to work on his game and would be given the opportunity to shine year 2, and he took it. Eddie Johnson would become the Kings' second option on offense, averaging 19.8 points to go along with 6.1 rebounds and 2.6 assists. Eddie Johnson was not the only King to have a breakout year this year, as Larry Drew headed the team, now being with his abilities to score and facilitate, setting up everyone. With Eddie Johnson and Larry Drew now leading the Kings, their record would improve drastically, going 45-37, but would ultimately fall short of missing the playoffs. In the offseason, the Kings would hit on their draft pick, adding LaSalle Thompson to the team. Despite Thompson's addition, though, the Kings would start the year struggling, being rather inconsistent up and down. Mid-year, the Kings would make a splash to help the team find its form in adding Reggie Theus. With the Kings adding new talent around Eddie Johnson, his game would only improve, where Johnson averaged 21.9 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 3.6 assists, helping the Kings go 38-44, which would be enough to make the playoffs as an 8 seed, where the Kansas City Kings would face a loaded Lakers team round 1 headed by Magic Johnson, Michael Cooper, James Worthy, Bob McAdoo, Jamal Wilkes, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Lakers would be without Wilkes this series, but that did not seem to slow them down at all, as Magic Johnson would put on a clinic against the Kings, seeing them get swept altogether. In Eddie Johnson's first playoff experience, he averaged 17 points, 4 assists, and 3.3 rebounds. In the offseason, the Kings would continue to improve long-term in adding Otis Thorpe through the draft. Next season, Johnson would continue to lead the Kings in scoring with 22.9 points to go along with 3.3 assists and 5 rebounds. Despite Eddie Johnson seeming to be on the up and up, the Kings drafting well, the team would struggle to find its form under new coaching, going 31-51, missing the playoffs. The Kings would find themselves in a new home next year, as new ownership from the other year had finally gotten the league to approve the move from Kansas City to Sacramento. Johnson, the up-and-coming season, would find himself playing in a new role. Early into the year, the Kings were struggling to find a scoring presence with the second unit, so Eddie Johnson would start to come off the bench and play slightly less minutes, seeing his numbers dip to 18.7 points, 5.1 rebounds, and 2.6 assists. The move seemed to work, however, as the Kings went 37-45, getting into the playoffs as a 7 seed. In round 1, the Sacramento Kings would match up against Hakeem Olajuwon, Ralph Sampson, and the Houston Rockets. The Kings over the series appeared to have no answers for Olajuwon and Sampson, seeing them get swept altogether out of the playoffs again. Despite Eddie Johnson's best efforts in Game 3, where he scored 33 points. Over the series, Johnson averaged 18.7 points, 7 rebounds, and 1.3 assists. After another disappointing playoff run, the Kings would decide to shake things up, trading away Mike Woodson and Larry Drew for Derek Smith. With the moves, Otis Thorpe would take on a larger role, developing into the second option on the team behind Theus, seeing Eddie Johnson playing a similar role to the prior year, averaging almost identical numbers with 18.7 points, 3.1 assists, and 4.4 rebounds. However, the trades to improve the Kings only seemed to hurt them, as they would go 29-53, missing the playoffs. In the offseason, after another disappointing year, the Kings would continue to shake up things. The Kings decided to trade Eddie Johnson to the Phoenix Suns for Ed Pinckney and a second-round pick that would go on to become Fennis Stenbo. Johnson was now on an aging and struggling Suns team headed by Walter Davis and Larry Nance. Nance would not be around for very long this season, though. The Suns would decide to trade Nance while his value was still high to the Cleveland Cavaliers for a package that netted him multiple picks and a future All-Star in Kevin Johnson. With Nance being traded away, Eddie Johnson was the second option on the team to Davis, seeing Johnson average 17.7 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 2.5 assists. All the while, the Suns floundered, going 28-54, missing the playoffs. The next season, the Suns would look entirely different. Walter Davis would be traded away to the Nuggets for draft capital, which would free up the room for the Suns to make a splash in free agency, signing Tom Chambers. And the Suns would also not be finished there, drafting Dan Marley with the pick they acquired from the Larry Nance trade. And the changes continue. There's Kevin Johnson and Jeff Hornacek would improve their game tremendously this year. With all the changes, Eddie Johnson would start to play the six-man role full time. But this did anything but slow Eddie Johnson down, where he averaged 21.5 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 2.3 assists, along the way winning the 6th Man of the Year award for his efforts, on a rejuvenated Suns team that went 55-27, getting a 3 seed. In round 1, the Suns would face the Denver Nuggets, led by Alex English, Fat Lever, Michael Adams, and Walter Davis. Game 1 of the series would be neck and neck, but Phoenix would just squeak by. In Game 2, Fat Lever would go down with an injury, which would alter the competitiveness of the series, seeing the Suns sweep the Nuggets altogether. In round 2, the Suns matched up against the Golden State Warriors with Chris Mullin and Mitch Richmond. Outside of Game 2 of the series, it was rather lopsided, with the Suns being too much to handle for the Warriors, advancing 4-1 thanks to big performances from Eddie Johnson, leading the team in rebounding one game, while also scoring 34 points in Game 4. In the Western Conference Finals awaiting the Suns was Magic Johnson, Byron Scott, James Worthy, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and the Los Angeles Lakers. The series would be another lopsided one, but this time it was in favor of the Lakers, as James Worthy and Byron Scott would just pick apart the Suns throughout, resulting in the Suns getting swept. Eddie Johnson, over the run to the Western Conference Finals, averaged 17.8 points, 2.1 assists, and 7.3 rebounds. Next season, Jeff Hornacek and Dan Marley would only continue to grow and improve, reducing Eddie Johnson's touches within the offense, as well as Johnson started to miss some time this season with injuries, seeing his numbers dip to 16.9 points, 3.8 rebounds, and 1.7 assists. All the while, the Suns would go up with a similar record, going 54-28, getting a 5 seed. In round 1, the Suns matched up against the Utah Jazz, led by John Stockton, Karl Malone, Thurl Bailey, and Mark Eaton. The series would be tightly contested, with big performances throughout by multiple players. Eddie Johnson's shining moment would be when he dropped 33 points in Game 4, but the Suns struggled to stop Malone as well, losing the game, creating a winner-go-home Game 5. Game 5 was like the rest of the series, tight throughout with the game being tied up late. The Suns had the ball, and Kevin Johnson would play the role of a hero, hitting a game-winning jump shot, sending the Phoenix Suns into round 2. The Suns would again find themselves playing the Los Angeles Lakers, but the Lakers no longer had Kareem. The Suns entered the series more confident this go-around as well, and would steal Game 1, setting the tone with revenge on their mind in the series. The game plan was simple yet effective. Let Magic do what Magic does and slow down everyone else. The Suns did just that, upsetting the Lakers in a rather convincing fashion, 4-1. The Suns were back in the Western Conference Finals. In this go-around, the Suns would meet the Portland Trail Blazers, who had Clyde Drexler, Jerome Kersey, and Terry Porter. The series would start off with the heart-wrenching losses for Phoenix, as they would lose Game 1 and 2 on baskets late from Duckworth and Porter. The Suns bounced back, winning the next 2 games, but the Blazers would respond right back with big games from Clyde Drexler, sending the Suns home 4-2. The trip back to the Western Conference Finals, Eddie Johnson found himself playing a smaller role, averaging 12.3 points, 1.1 assists, and 3.6 rebounds. The Suns entered next year attempting to get over the hump that was the Western Conference Finals, and the Suns trying to make the next step that would help them advance would make a bold trade. The Suns traded away Eddie Johnson and 2 first-round picks that would become Leron Ellis and Sharon Wright to the Sonics for Xavier McDaniel, who was butting heads with teammates at the time. Eddie Johnson was now on a young Sonics team, with Shawn Kemp being in year 2 and a rookie Gary Payton, to go along with other vets in Derek McKee and Ricky Pierce. Eddie Johnson for his first year would play the second fiddle to Ricky Pierce, averaging 16.7 points, 3.3 rebounds, and 1.4 assists between Phoenix and Seattle, helping the Sonics go 41-41, getting into the playoffs as an 8 seed. In a round 1 matchup awaiting them in Portland Trailblazers again, who knocked Eddie Johnson out the prior year. Portland would jump out, winning the first 2 games behind Clyde Drexler's play. The Sonics bounced back, winning the next 2 games, with Sedale Threat hitting a game winner in Game 3, and Eddie Johnson leading the way in Game 4, scoring 34 points, creating a winner-go-home Game 5. Game 5 would be all Portland, though, jumping out to an early lead and holding on to it, defeating the Sonics 3-2. Over the series, Eddie Johnson averaged 24 points, 1.4 assists, and 4.2 rebounds. Next season, Johnson would continue to play a similar role, averaging almost identical numbers with 17.1 points, 3.6 rebounds, and 2 assists. With Johnson's consistent play and the improving core of Seattle, the Sonics would go 47-35, getting a 3 seed, and the Golden State Warriors round 1 headed by Chris Mullin, Tim Hardaway, Sarunas Marcionis, and Billy Owens. The series would have multiple close games, but Shawn Kemp was having a breakout series, helping the Sonics advance 3-1. In round 2, the Sonics would play the Utah Jazz, who had Karl Malone, Jeff Malone, Mark Eaton, and John Stockton. Over the series, Karl Malone terrorized the Sonics, seeing them go home without much of a fight, losing in 5 games. Over the playoffs, Eddie Johnson averaged 18.4 points and 3 rebounds. Next season, the Sonics would only continue to improve as Kemp was starting to become a star player, with Payton improving as well. With the improvements came a smaller role for Eddie Johnson within the offense, seeing his numbers dip to 14.4 points, 3.3 rebounds, and 1.6 assists. But Johnson was now on a thriving Sonics team that went 55-27, getting into the playoffs as a 3 seed. In round 1, the Sonics would meet the team that sent him home the prior year, in the Utah Jazz. The Sonics would find themselves in a similar role, trailing the Jazz 2-1 in the best-of-5 series, before Eddie Johnson would lead the team in Game 4, scoring 24 points, creating a Game 5. In Game 5, Seattle would start off insanely slow, only scoring 30 points in the first half. Yet the Sonics would come out the second half on fire, coming back and winning the game in stunning fashion and winning the series. In round 2, the Sonics would face Hakeem Olajuwon and the Houston Rockets. Olajuwon kept the Rockets around, taking over the series at times, causing the series to go to Game 7. Game 7 was close throughout, with both teams battling, where Seattle would hold on late as Olajuwon missed the game-tying 3. Making it back to the Western Conference Finals, Eddie Johnson, this time with Seattle, would match up against his former team in the Phoenix Suns, who had improved since he left with the addition of Charles Barkley. Seattle found itself in another grueling series, as the Suns and Sonics would be evenly matched, splitting their first 6 games. In Game 7, the series would finally tip in Phoenix's favor, behind a monstrous performance from Charles Barkley, seeing Eddie Johnson sent home again just short of the finals, this time by his prior team. Eddie Johnson, over the run to the Western Conference Finals, averaged 10.8 points and 2.4 rebounds. Just before the start of next season, Eddie Johnson found himself being traded again, with the hopes of the move getting the Sonics over the top. Eddie Johnson was traded to the Charlotte Hornets along with Dana Barros and a first-round pick that would go on to become Sharon Wright for the Kendall Gill and a first-round pick that became Carlos Rogers. Eddie Johnson was joining a Hornets team that had playoff success prior years behind Alonzo Mourning, Larry Johnson, Del Curry, and Muggsy Boggs. Eddie Johnson would become a role player for this team, coming off the bench, averaging 11.5 points, 3.1 rebounds, and 1.7 assists. The Hornets on the year looked like a playoff team, but Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning would miss significant time with injury, causing the Hornets to come up just short of making the playoffs, going 41-41. Eddie Johnson was a free agent, and in the offseason, he would decide to take his talents overseas and play in Greece for Olympiakos. While playing for Olympiakos, Eddie Johnson excelled, averaging 21.2 points, 5 rebounds, and 2.1 assists, along the way leading Olympiakos to the Greek Basketball League title, where he won the Finals MVP. After the successful year overseas, the NBA would come back a-calling again. Eddie Johnson would sign in free agency, joining the Indiana Pacers. Johnson was now on a Pacers team led by Reggie Miller, Dale Davis, Mark Jackson, Antonio Davis, and Rick Smits. Eddie Johnson would come off the bench, providing a spark, averaging 7.7 points and 2.5 rebounds, helping the Pacers go 52-30, getting a 3 seed. In round 1, the Pacers faced the Atlanta Hawks, with Steve Smith and Mookie Blaylock leading them, in a series where Indiana would normally be heavy favorites, but Reggie Miller was out with an injury, causing things to shift. The Hawks, behind Steve Smith's play, made it a series with Miller down and out, forcing it to go to a Game 5. In Game 5, Miller returned with the series on the line. Reggie Miller would play great, keeping the Pacers close. The Hawks were still ultimately in charge, leading it late by 2 points. Miller would have a look at the buzzer, but would come up short, seeing the Pacers upset in round 1. In the series, Eddie Johnson played sparingly in only 1 game. Next season, the Pacers started off the year struggling. As a result, the Pacers would make a trade. Eddie Johnson would be traded by the Indiana Pacers as a trade chip with Vincent Askew and 2 second-round picks that would become Jason Lawson and Tremaine Folks to the Denver Nuggets for Mark Jackson and LaSalle Thompson. Shortly after the trade, the Denver Nuggets waived Eddie Johnson. Eddie Johnson went on to sign for a competitor in the Houston Rockets, who were led by Hakeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, and Charles Barkley. In Houston, Johnson would play a similar role to that he was in Indiana, averaging 8.2 points and 2.7 rebounds coming off the bench, seeing the Rockets go 57-25, getting a 3 seed. In round 1, the Rockets matched up against the Minnesota Timberwolves, who had Kevin Garnett, Tom Gugliotta, and Stephen Marbury leading them. The Big Three from Minnesota would play solidly this series, but it ultimately was not enough as the Rockets had more firepower, sweeping them. In round 2, the Rockets faced Eddie Johnson's former team in the Seattle Supersonics, who had Gary Payton and Sean Kemp still leading them, with the addition of Detlef Schrempf now. Both teams were evenly matched throughout, with multiple close games seeing the series go to Game 7, where again it was close late with Houston leading. Seattle had a chance to tie things up late, but Kemp would miss the shot, seeing the Rockets advance 96-91. In the Western Conference Finals, the Rockets met John Stockton, Karl Malone, and the Utah Jazz. The Rockets found themselves in a hole early, trailing the series 2-0, before Eddie Johnson would get hot in Game 3, scoring 31 points, putting the team on the back, winning the game. Game 4 was an evenly matched game, with the game being tied up with 6.7 seconds left. The Rockets had possession of the ball and a chance to win it, where Eddie Johnson came to the rescue, hitting a 3 at the buzzer, tying the series up. The Jazz went on to win Game 5. In Game 6, it would be tight and tied late with 2.8 seconds left, with the Jazz having the ball this go-around, where John Stockton would hit a shot at the buzzer, sending the Rockets home 4-2. Over the postseason, Eddie Johnson averaged 8.3 points and 2.3 rebounds. Next season, the Rockets had brought him back in a similar team as well. Eddie, playing the similar role to the prior year, averaged 8.4 points and 2 rebounds on a Rockets team that was struggling more this go-around, with injuries taking their toll on Barkley and Olajuwon, with the Rockets barely making it into the playoffs, going 41-41. In round 1, awaiting the Rockets was the team that sent them home in the prior year in the Jazz. The series again was close at times, yet the Jazz found themselves in control for the most part, as Barkley was not fully healthy this go-around, resulting in the Jazz winning the series in 5 games. Over the series, Eddie Johnson averaged 5.6 points and 1.6 rebounds. In the offseason, Clyde Drexler had retired, and the Rockets brought in Scottie Pippen to replace him. The Rockets would play solidly this year with Pippen on the team, going 31-19. However, Eddie Johnson was not a big part of this, as he only played in 3 games this season, where he averaged 4 points, with age and health catching up to him. The Rockets had made it into the playoffs but would find themselves going home rather quickly to Kobe and Shaq-led Lakers, in a series where Eddie Johnson did not touch the floor. Not long after, Eddie Johnson would retire. Over 17 years in the NBA, Eddie Johnson averaged 16 points, 4 rebounds, and 2.1 assists. Eddie Johnson in retirement has stuck around the game of basketball as a broadcaster for the Phoenix Suns. Eddie Johnson will be remembered for his pure jump shot and ability to get open by running off screens non-stop, being a consistent scoring threat for multiple franchises, eventually becoming the prototype of what you want in a sixth man, even winning the award at one point, all the while playing for playoff teams that always seem to fall up just short of reaching the NBA Finals. Wherever Eddie Johnson went, he brought a smooth jump shot and a winning attitude and culture. Thanks for watching this video on Eddie Johnson's career. If you want to see any other videos in the future about any random players, leave them in the comments below and I may or may not decide to do a video on them. Thanks again for watching. This has been Skid Denver.